Good afternoon, everyone. For anybody who I'm friends with on Facebook or who follows me at all on any platform of social media, you know that I've been hinting about a secret project for several months now. Um, it's no big secret. It's just kind of my little inside joke with myself. I'm working on a book of short stories. I haven't put out a book of short stories since I want to say 2014 or so, and even then, that was more of a novella. I don't remember how many stories there were in it. I think I had something around nine stories or something. But this is a big book of shorts. It's comprised of stories I've written recently, stories I started a long time ago and didn't know how to finish, or stories I wrote a long time ago and didn't know what to do with, or didn't have anything to do with them. The oldest story is something I wrote back in, I think, 1989, back when I was in eighth grade. Uh, I It's horrible, but I included it nonetheless because it's fun. Uh, it's I always have to look again at the title because it's hard for me to remember, and I'm the one who came up with it. But the name of the secret project is Absolute Garbage, Total Nonsense, and Utter Ridiculousness. It's a book of stories ranging from horror to psychological to bizarro. The only thing I specifically did not want was zombie stories in this one. I had a few that I'd included originally, but as it was coming together and it was kind of a through line was kind of coming to mind for me, I decided to take all those stories out, and I'm probably going to just throw those into their own book. So far, all the stories that I've taken out, either finished or unfinished, is totaling something like 35,000 words. So I mean, that's a novella on its own. So I might do something with that soon, but this is up. I've also included a great deal of poetry. I used to write a lot of poetry. When I was in college, I took a couple poetry classes, and I'd written a lot there and workshopped. I found poems that I either don't remember writing or I have no idea what was going through my head at the time. And a lot of poems I found I don't know, was autobiographical, for lack of a better term, because it makes more sense to me now. I thought I was just writing a poem, but it really was anthemic to something I might have been going through at the time. I won't say which ones, but some are. Some are just poems. I also included poems I wrote when I was a senior in high school to my girlfriend, and they are awful. I put those and the story I wrote in eighth grade at the very end, so anybody who just, if it's too syrupy, you can just close it, or if it's just a horrible story, you can just say, hey, you know what? This last story is the last story. I don't need to read that other one. But I threw some of everything in it. It runs the full gamut so far as story. I mean, I got some, my opinion, some funny stories. Some things are disturbing, I think. Some things are just flat out fun. Uh, so what I'm going to do is read a story that I don't have a title for. I just called it X. If I don't come up with a title for it, I just don't come up with a title for it. But I thought of this story actually a few days ago while I was lying in bed, and I almost forgot it. So I just sat and remembered it. Luckily, this was one of those for anybody who's a writer who might be listening or watching. You know what I'm talking about. When you think of that idea and you say, I know I'm going to remember it. And it's a 50-50 chance you will. But this was one I was actually able to recall. And for now, it's called X. Now, I just wrote it. I haven't gone over it, so I'm bound to make some mistakes. So if you find me pausing, I'm editing in my head before I speak out loud. Mr. Phipps looked across his little desk in his little office at the little couple. They were middle aged, handsome to a degree, but oddly disturbing. For starters, the husband was dead. He wasn't all the way dead. Mr. Phipps couldn't help but note how the man's eyes seemed to lock onto his and occasionally flicker around the room. The couple had walked in his office and sat down, but that had been before Mr. Phipps realized the man was no longer entirely with us. But he was determined to be professional. Mr. Phipps cleared his throat. I'm Matthew Phipps. How might I make your life better? He mentally kicked himself, realizing he should have skipped asking the agency credo. The Michigan Organization of Redressable Grievances was a quasi-governmental agency that filtered out incidents and accidents that required police action from those that didn't. Any action more could divert away from police and resolve was how they kept the lights on, although there was still a fee involved when something did require police involvement. The last part was so the organization didn't try to hog and underreport actual crimes. Mr. and Mrs. Clark, the woman said. She had a cherubic face despite her middle-aged and short, curly blonde hair. Mr. Clark looked like he'd been handsome in life, lean-faced and bald on top, with a Van Dyke and large brown eyes. He looked uncomfortable beyond just being dead, and when Mr. Phipps realized why his face looked so mask-like, it made him uncomfortable all over again. The sutures emerging from the man's scalp and across his forehead meant his face had been peeled down so an enemy could use a striker saw to remove the cap of his skull to examine his brain. Mr. Clark had been autopsied. Helen, let me address the elephant in the room. Mrs. Clark, she said. Sorry, Mrs. Clark. I'm sure you're here because of your husband. She nodded, that odd smile still on her face. I'm presuming this has something to do with his present condition? Oh, absolutely. I tried to tell them he wasn't dead, but they didn't listen. Nothing can disturb my Harry when he's sleeping. He once slept all the way through a house fire. Mr. Phipps had only skimmed the file, so he hadn't read anything about this if it were in there. Excuse me? Slept? How do you mean? He slept through it, Mrs. Clark said again. One morning, I woke up when I smelled smoke. A minute later, the detector went off. I tried to shake Harry, but I already knew better. He never wakes up until he's done sleeping. He was too heavy for me to drag out of the house, so I got out as quickly as I could, and I went to a neighbor to call 911. By the time any kind of help arrived, the whole house was in flames. The firefighters couldn't get to him, but he was fine when the fire was out. How could he have been fine after the fire was put out? Mr. Phipps was incredulous. Even if the man hadn't been burnt to death, he would have died from smoke inhalation. Mrs. Clark shrugged. They found him in the bedroom under the covers. The alarm went off, and he got up. Mr. Phipps was having difficulty reconciling her story with what he was seeing. Without seeing the dead men in front of him, he wouldn't have believed, even though one technically may not have had anything to do with the other. He thought it might have been best to stay on task. Regardless, Mrs. Clark, your husband's condition is final. There really isn't anything I could do. EMTs arrived on scene, attempted to resuscitate Mr. Clark. They were still administering life-saving measures at the hospital, which were continued by hospital staff. He was pronounced at 7 a.m. I apologize for my bluntness, but everyone down the line did their jobs. Is there anything you would have me do to improve this situation? Mrs. Clark shook her head, forming her mouth into an O before she spoke. Oh, we're not concerned about that. Roger's been declared dead a bunch of times and never quite got this far, but we're dealing with it. She looked from her husband to Mr. Phipps again, a twinkle in her eye. In fact, it may have improved things. Improved, madam? Yes, yes. Oh, yes. You know that expression, when you remove one organ, the rest compensate? Mr. Phipps recalled that expression being about senses and not organs, but he nodded, comfortable he had the gist of her meaning. Well, they removed all of Ed's internal organs, stuffed them all back in him in a plastic bag. I had to snip him back open to take him out, but our sex life has never been better. Mr. Phipps blinked several times, understanding but not wanting to understand what she meant. There was a box of tissues on the opposite side of his desk for the many people who sat where the Clark sat, and he leaned forward in his little chair, his considerably long upper body high view of their lower body. It looked like a python had been lying in his lap when Mr. Clark had put his pants on. Well, what do you want me to do? Mr. Phipps was struggling to maintain his concentration as the constant smile on Mrs. Clark's face took on a new connotation. If you don't mind that your husband is, you know, with us in body but not in spirit, it's the ME's office, Mrs. Clark said, and she reached up to touch the top of her husband's bald head. I can't get anybody on the phone to get his toupee back. The end. So, like I said, I am working on this now. I'm hoping to have this finished by late next month, early September. So be looking out for it. I will be talking talking about it, and I will post the cover again. I posted the cover once, but I got to dig it up. I think I got it stuck somewhere, and I just haven't looked at it in a while. But thanks for coming.